Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of Para and Rideshare Rodeo, doing a little bit on the drivers' rights movement that we've talked about with you guys, but we have not really jumped in to highlight some of what's going on, and even now after the elections, the importance of this and what is going on. I want to introduce the panel that we have tonight. I have Nick here. Nick is a tax practitioner and also running for mayor of where?
Ferguson, Missouri.
Ferguson, Missouri. So maybe a little background on that. We'll get to that. We have Michelle Sleet, who we always love having. Michelle runs two of the largest DoorDash Facebook groups and deals with a lot of what we all deal with when we get into this stuff about hearing just about everything from everybody. And of course, we have David, CEO of Para. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the driver's rights plan this week and then the following 2 weeks. So really want to make sure everybody's checking out the website, getting over there, signing up. Maybe you're already signed up. Get over there again. Just kind of refamiliarize yourself. And I think that probably the best place to start is the 4 basic principles. So, David, your mic is muted. Okay, you unmuted it.
Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure. But yeah. So I think David walks us through this pretty well. So let's start here.
Yeah. So thanks for having me, Steve. As always, we believe, I guess, in 4 very basic principles to create a better gig economy that put drivers back in the driver's seat. So I'm in charge of my work. I have a say in the system. My time is valuable. I own my data. And I know sort of this is, we believe that, all of these things should hold true. And this is really what it means to be an independent contractor, that these are your rights as an independent contractor, and that we believe the platform should honor their obligations to these rights. So I know we've been talking a lot about these 4 points, and we sort of had this petition that went out with a bunch of people who signed it, and not too much has happened over the last month or two. I just want to give people just a quick update about what's been in the works. We haven't just been sitting on our hands and doing nothing. So a couple things have happened. One, I've been working with a lawyer at a law firm to actually get sort of like a legal opinion on what it means to be an independent contractor and how your data and your rights should pertain to that. So like an actual proper, law firm sign off on it with his opinion on that. And this is somebody who's done work both for and against the gig platforms previously. So an expert in the space. Using that, I've also started to write, the beginning of sort of a manifesto, and sort of where that starts off with is sort of like the promise of gig work is broken. Here's what we need to do to make it better. And sort of I'm expecting to receive a draft from this lawyer this week. We'll sort of, first take a look at what he says. And from there, the next steps really is I want to make a public doc where everyone can come and drop their thoughts and give us feedback. And basically, collectively, we can write what we think makes sense or what's needed for gig economy 2.0, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's a great start. I haven't checked recently on the tally of the signatures. I don't know if it stalled out a bit or whatnot, but if so, we got to get that thing kickstarted again because that thing was moving and growing. We need to get more drivers signed on to this, and I think that I guess let's go over to Nick. And Nick, I mean, David just described the 4 basic principles. How do you see what we need next as gig workers?
Well, I've been self-employed for almost my entire life. I was a freelance IT consultant for several decades, and back then there was never a question of me owning my business and controlling my data because it was mine. And what we've gotten into with these gig companies is people are nominally independent contractors, but they really don't have any control. And part of that is because of the structure of the system. And part of it is just that people don't know what they're doing. They sign up for DoorDash, the acceptance rate comes up in red, and they think, ooh, I'm in trouble. And they start running orders for $2.75 a piece. So, there's education components and there's also structural components. And I think we need to deal with both of them.
So if as a start and as a big start, I guess I'll ask you first, Michelle, is
Yep.
if full transparency were shown, like we're starting to see upfront pricing for Lyft, Uber.
Yes.
If full transparency were presented on every order, being a traditional independent contractor myself before these gig economy apps, and really working for myself, understanding the IC status, I'm happy with that. Like I would be would you be happy with seeing everything up front, and would you feel like you had anybody to blame if you didn't like the offers?
Oh, right. I'm 100% for seeing everything up front. I think that we have a right to know before we drive 10, 15 miles into a no man's land of what that job is going to pay us. And I wholeheartedly, in fact, it's one of my standard lines back to many of our members when they can't make any money and they're taking 225 orders and 250 orders. And I say, know your self-worth. Then, and maybe this isn't for you. If this is your market, this isn't for you. And I think DoorDash has, if we're just talking DoorDash. Now, as we know, Uber Eats hides tips as well. And in fact, they hide them much better. I asked, I asked a lot of people, they don't take Uber Eats because they're just too far. So I think that their food doesn't even get picked up because people just aren't going to drive 19 or 20 on a blind item, not knowing what they're going to make, but just staying on task and getting back to it. I know for a fact, other than me and other people who I have patience, and I'm out there to make money, and I'm out there for my hours, which is probably about 8 hours a day. But a lot of folks, they only have an hour or two, so they just take whatever they can get.
Right.
They just take it, and they take it, and it's almost like gambling. I'm going to take it because I may not get another order. They're not valuing their self-worth. And tonight, when I knew I was only going to be out for 2 hours, I waited and waited and waited by one of our best steakhouses in town, and lo and behold, I got a $53 order. So that made my night. But yesterday I threw away 80 orders to get one. And I was telling you earlier today, there's been a tide changing in our groups. People patting themselves on the back for acceptance rate, and people sending in and being proud of 95 to 100% acceptance rates. And I will say to them, I'll be the first one to write because I've approved their post. And I'll say, why are you taking everything? And then they'll come back and be defensive and say, well, I'm choosy. No, you're not being choosy if you're taking 100%. How can you be choosy? You're taking everything.
But see, this gets back to the education aspect, because these people are losing money every time they get in their car.
Yes, they are.
And if I want to do charity work, it's not going to be for DoorDash.
No.
Right. Nick and I, Nick had already started when I started, and we became fast pals. And he was my no tip, no trip guru.
Seems to be a lot of those out there.
Yes.
And for good reason. I mean, I gotta say, guys, I can see that, not to get too far off subject here, but I can see both sides of the tipping aspect, because coming from the service industry myself, working in bars and restaurants my whole last 30 years, I can tell you that the tip comes after the service. However, this is a different setup. and the tip comes before in this case. And because it comes before for most people, it somewhat becomes the new tip that's expected for gig platforms, is to do it up front.
Well, let's be honest, Steve. The tip usually doesn't come after the service.
No, I meant in the traditional.
You're right. In a restaurant, it
Yes.
does. If you're doing DoorDash and that order doesn't have a tip on it,
you're
odds are
not
you're
getting
not
one.
getting one.
Yeah.
So the people
And on
who-
Uber, you could, and I know that some people say this doesn't happen as much, but tip baiting does happen.
Yes.
People are able to put in a tip, and I think it's actually ridiculous that I used to think this when I did rideshare all the time too, is that I thought it was ridiculous that I thought it was nice you had 48 hours after the trip to add a tip, but I thought it was ridiculous that you could remove a tip for just by checking a checkbox that you just didn't want a tip, so you want to take it out.
Yeah.
You know, after the fact, it's not okay.
Well, you're effectively working for the tip, right? I mean, we see in our own data that 60 to 65% of a dasher's income, and this is average across a large number of dashers, is tip, right? So the reality is most of your pay is the tip, and you're working for the tip.
Right.
I think a lot of people don't realize that on sort of both sides. But I sort of like the question you said, which is like, hey, let's say that you get full transparency, and what's great is like we're starting to see a movement towards there. Is that really enough? And I like what Nick said earlier, is I had transparency around things, but I always knew I was in charge of my work. And I think that's really one thing here that we're really trying to highlight, is the idea that as these platforms and your work opportunities have become more technologically advanced, what's important is to be able to have technology that works sort of on behalf of the individual driver for yourself, right? So I think, having full transparency on the tip is great. But really what it means to be an independent contractor, not just having full transparency in it, is really having competition for your time, right? So the idea that, my time is valuable. And just in the way that the apps are designed right now, there's just so much friction purposely to make it so that you really can't have that competition for your time. And I think that's why we have these principles together, right? Is the idea that, you should be able to have that true competition for your time. And the way to do that is, to be able to say, hey, I want all my data in one feed. I want to get all my options in one place. I may be a little crazy, but I think it even goes beyond that, right? It's the idea that your work history is yours. It should belong to you. You should be in charge of your work profile, right? It shouldn't be hard. I would love Nick's thoughts on this, right? For you to file taxes or get all the information you need to calculate what you made in a year across the different platforms there. And I think that's really where I'm trying to push towards, is like, if you're an IC, you own your profile, you own your work history. It should be easy for you to access that, and you're in charge, not sort of the way it is the opposite way right now.
Well, I don't want to hijack the whole show with talking about taxes, which I totally could, but a lot of the problem with taxes is that people don't know what they're doing, and it costs them a lot of money. And I think these gig companies have some level of responsibility. When I signed up for DoorDash, I was already a tax practitioner, and it was the off season, and I was sitting on my front porch and I was bored, and I was like, oh, well, I got nothing to do this evening. Let's load up DoorDash and see what happens. And 15 minutes later, I was in my car going to pick up somebody's food. Now, I'm a tax practitioner, and I do continuing education and all sorts of things. So I know what to do with this. Your average Joe that was sitting on his front porch drinking a beer and loaded an app on a lark doesn't have a clue. And he's going to get to the end of the year. He's going to get his 1099. He's not going to have the appropriate business records that the IRS wants, and it's going to cost him a ton of money. And honestly, DoorDash makes you go through all these little videos before you can start driving. They ought to make you sit through a 10-minute video on what you need to do with your taxes, or you're going to be in big trouble next April or whenever the IRS figures out what's going on. And they don't, because you're independent and they don't care.
Well, I would interject this, and this isn't coming to the defense. I'm just playing devil's advocate here that traditional ICs don't get that handheld walkthrough and everything they do too about their taxes. But what I will say, being an Uber driver, I have had some very serious discussions with people around the country. One specifically here in Denver, who had some challenges. He was on the spectrum, and this was during the pandemic, and he was doing rideshare to help his mom and him pay the rent. And when taxes came around in January, is it the Form K and then the other form? He got confused because he saw Uber showing two different earnings amounts. And so he's kind of thinking like, wait, what? And he claimed the wrong one.
Ooh.
Now, in claiming the wrong one, he lost all of his PUA and then times like another 100%. He basically had to pay back all the PUA plus another 100% of that for screwing up these taxes and putting the wrong number in. And my thing becomes, I think there could be tax reform that makes taxes much more easier to understand for everybody. But I don't understand why something like Uber does this. I don't understand it. I mean, I do, because they're trying to say you're the independent contractor. But if I'm the independent contractor, wouldn't I be able to look up every one of my clients? Wouldn't I be able to look into every single record? And I don't have that ability when they send me these double sets of records.
And I think you're spot on there, Steve, right? Which is exactly his idea. Is like a lot of the time the platform is very conveniently say, hey, we can't tell you how to do your taxes because you're an IC. We can't tell you what the policy is for you being dispatched trips because you're an IC. But when it comes to other things like what benefits the driver as an IC, we're gonna, not wipe our hands of that, or we're not going to honor our obligations, right? So it's sort of this,
Yeah.
duality.
Well, I mean,
of
when
one where
you're an
good-
IC, but when you're driving for Uber, you are an IC, but your client isn't the person in your car. Your client is Uber. So
Well,
you have your
Uber
you
likes
have
it to
your
be
client.
that it's not Uber, that it's the
or,
person in your car.
or Uber, in Uber's perspective, technically you're Uber's client, right? Is actually how they view it.
I mean, who that person is, that's Uber's customer, and Uber, you're not getting a 1099 from that guy that's in your car. You're getting you're getting two 1099s from Uber. And by the way, there's a reason for that. Uber is doing both payment processing and providing bonuses. The bonuses are on a 1099 NEC because those are monies coming directly from Uber. The 1099K is the same thing you get if somebody's sending you money through Cash App. If you get over $600 in Cash App this year, you're going to get a 1099K. And the deal with that is it may or may not be income, and you have to explain to the IRS what that money is.
See, and that's where I think one of the big problems comes in, because, okay, if knock wood, I were to get audited, right, for my ride share, and they come in and they're like, okay, who were all your passengers? I'd be like, I don't know. They're all under Uber's documents. Well, you have both sets of the numbers. Yeah, but I don't have any breakdown. I just have the two numbers. But weren't they your clients? Yes. Indirectly.
Well, the answer is no. And you don't have to tell them who your clients are, but you do have to tell them where you drove and how many miles. And there's apps that'll track that for the people that figured that out before they started driving. But I know lots of people who get to the end of the year and they're like, where can I download my miles from DoorDash? Well, you basically can't. So good luck with that.
Right. And something interesting is that I try to add content to my smaller page on a regular basis. And so I believe it was around September 15th. I said, don't forget to pay your employment taxes today. And the floodgates were open, and they were defensive, and they were negative, and said, I don't have to pay taxes. My accountant told me I didn't have to pay taxes. What are you talking about? Taxes? I mean, not one person would fess up that they were going to pay taxes. And what
Well,
happens? Aren't you have to pay an employment tax, right, Nick? And if you don't
right,
pay your
right.
tax, you have to pay a penalty that you didn't pay.
True.
Yes.
And the only exception I would say is if somebody has a W-2 job and they've got enough withholding that they would normally get a refund, and they're very limited in what they're doing in a gig job, and it's just eating away at their refund, but hasn't gotten them more than $1,000 into the red, then technically, no, they don't have to pay estimated taxes. But anybody who's doing this day in and day out, if they're not paying estimated taxes, then they're going to pay a penalty. And the reality is they're not going to have the money and they're going to get into trouble.
Yeah, and that's what happens because most people, unfortunately, they lose a tire and they're out of the game. We get that post every day too.
Sure.
While we try to inform them to have emergency funds and to take so much out of every paycheck and put it in an emergency fund account, how many you think actually do that?
But I gotta say, I'm not excusing it, but it's a lot easier said than done for a lot of us. That fund is a very hard. I know a lot of gig workers, and that fund is very hard to get started.
It is, but
Now, does that mean that that should be shining a light on something bigger here? Like, hey, if that's a problem for you, then maybe reevaluate something or build a little something more before you jump in fully. Probably, but at the same time, these are people multi-apping, just trying to get off the ground, saying, I know I can get this. They start seeing their amounts growing, but then, like you said, yeah, something goes wrong, $800 car fix or something. They've just saved up 600 thinking they're putting it away. All of a sudden, they don't even have enough to fix the car, and now it just seems like it's very difficult to put away money in the gig economy. It's difficult to put away money in general right now, but it's very difficult to put away money in the gig economy. And I'm all for portable benefits, things of those natures too. Like, I think that stuff needs to start growing a lot.
But it's even hard for people to know like what they're earning, right? People don't really know. Like, if I finish driving on a day and I'm driving 3 or 4 apps, I don't really know what I made until I go and add those up. And yet again, I also don't have net earnings, right? So I think it's just one of those where, you can say, hey, you should do the math. I can do the math. You should track those things. But I'll admit that, like, I'm not the most organized person sometimes, right? And I think a lot of people fall into that bucket there. And I think, that's part of what we started working on, Steve, right, is the idea that.
But what happens, Nick, if you don't take out your own FICA and all that?
Well, I mean, right. Then you get to April, and look, I know people that are gig workers that just don't file their tax return. And guess what? You're racking up big penalties, and the IRS is eventually going to catch up with you, and you're going to have a problem now. And the
Nick,
problem,
are you referring to gig workers, obviously, who have another W-2 and are doing part-time?
Well, if you've got another W-2, then what they're going to do is they're going to seize your refund.
Right.
If you're just a straight up gig worker, I know people who are just full-time gig workers and just like, well, I'm just not going to file taxes and we'll see what happens. Well, it's fairly predictable what's going to happen, and it takes the IRS a few years to catch up with you, but they will. But it starts with the mentality that, somebody goes out in the morning and loads up Instacart or Uber or whatever they're doing, and they get to the end of the day and it says $200 on the screen, and they think, ooh, I made $200 today. Isn't that great? Well, you really didn't. You drove 100 miles, and that's $50. So you're down to 150. And then you've got to pay 30% in self-employment and income tax on that 150, which gets you down to 105. And then you've got car repairs and so on and so forth. So, really, maybe you made $50 today.
So what is the advice then, either Michelle or Nick, to the gig worker who really is going to give this their go? We've seen a lot of people be successful at it. We've seen a lot of people fall by the wayside. What would the suggestion be to get started? Would it be to hold on to a part-time W-2 while you build a little bit of safety net, then see if you want to cross over to full-time? Or what would your best advice be to to somebody who's you feel pretty good about them stepping into the gig world. And they've got a plan that makes sense to you. They're going to multi-app. They've got this down. They've tried it a couple times, but now they're ready.
Well, I try to give this advice to everybody who I stand next to. When I say, hey, when they got their brand new shiny red DoorDash bag that they brought into a salad place, and I'll say, hey, I know that they're out for their first time, and I'll try to give them the whole thing about, hey, so is this all you're doing? Well, yes, I'm between jobs, and I thought I would try it, and I do try to give them the best advice and tell them, again, what David's principles are: know your self-worth, value your time. Try to do, if you can't do 3 or 4 in 1 hour, unless of course like tonight when I got my big guy of $53, that's great. And I love the DoorDash large order program, so I can be involved in that. And don't try to be that top dasher and fall into the DoorDash shenanigans and manipulations of taking everything, because that 250, the minute you step in your car, is no longer 250. And with gas, it almost, well, now we were saying $5 a gallon at Ford. Okay, and that's another basic rule. And they'll say, okay, you don't want me taking a no tip order. How can I tell that there's a tip on my order? Well, it's in my market, it's nothing under $6.25 or less, because the base pays $2.25, $4 added to that. And why would you, if someone doesn't want to give you $4, the price of a gasoline, don't take the order. It's not even worth it. And watch those miles. The miles are everything. And not all miles are created equal. If I take my 3 miles back into no man's land, into a subdivision, that's horrible, because then I'm taking 3 miles back out of that subdivision. But if I take a quick 3-mile trip right down a highway, stay right by the restaurants. So know your market.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And I would say, and what I would add to that is keep good records. Use an app to track your mileage. Write down in a notebook, this is the date that I went out and I drove this many miles. Have some sort of backup to that app. And just keep very detailed records of what you're doing. I've got a guy who is an independent contractor who works as a salesman, and the IRS, he kept records. The IRS disallowed all of his travel expenses, and at the moment we're fighting about a tax bill of $10,000. And the IRS is not accommodating when you disagree with them. So you don't want to go there. Keep the records up front so that if the IRS comes calling, you've got what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, we have a lot more to discuss on this driver's right movements. I hope that because we'll be doing another one next week, and I hope that both of you will be joining us. I don't know if you will, so here I am just throwing it out there, but hopefully both of you will be joining David and I again, because I would love to continue this conversation. I think this is a good foursome to.
I wish this would have gone on. I
this.
wish this would have gone on longer, so we'll make the live.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking too. There's so much to talk about, and luckily we have 2 more of these that we'll be doing. So join us next week, and hopefully we can bring these same people back, because I think that again, there's a lot to cover. Even in the 4 basic principles, I'm looking through some of the bullet points, and the manifesto that I think is awesome, because that's what David and I were going to call it in the beginning when we were building this thing. Like, hey, we need to write a manifesto. I don't know why that word kept sticking in our heads, but it seemed like that was what was needed. But it really has been a pleasure, and I really want to get these guys back as a whole. And hopefully maybe all 3 parts we could just conclude as this group. We can ask these guys. But until then, make sure you guys check out driverrights.org, and any links to any of our guests tonight will be in the show notes. So if you want to look up Nick for his tax for his tax purposes, or you want to look up what he's doing for mayor, we'll put all that in the links. We'll obviously put Michelle's 2 Facebook groups in the
Yes.
links, as well as the para link that you would obviously have, but maybe some of the other socials, as well as the website, will all be in the show notes. So you can find them all in there. And we will see you back here next week to really get into this a lot more, actually, because there's a lot more to this. But until then, if you could please go to driverrights.org. Again, it's not driver's rights, it's driver singular rights.org. And check it out. I'm not even going to tell you what to do, but just go check it out. See if you agree. See if you like transparency. Sign your name to it. Share it. Share it on everything. Share it on Reddit. If you're on Reddit, share it on Reddit, please. See how long it can stay up before somebody rips it down.
Driver rights is allowed on Reddit. Just the para's banned.
Yeah, don't add the word para next to it, because they might rip it down just for that reason alone. Crazy people. But anyway, we will see you back here next week. I really enjoyed this, and I hope that we can continue with the same group. So thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks,
and
Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
hopefully we'll be back here next week. Okay, guys.